The ocean makes up more than 70% of the Earth's surface. And below the waves are some of the most fascinating and important species. But there's still a lot we don't know about what lives in the sea.
I love how when you look out at the ocean surface, you do not necessarily know what is right below you. And there have been a few times where I've plopped into the water and been like, whoa, I can't believe this was like right down here under the boat.
This is Wild World. I'm Scott Solomon. In this episode, we visit the seas around the South Pacific island of Moorea. Take a look at a map of the world, and the Pacific Ocean looks like a vast blue expanse with little more than seawater all the way from California to Australia. But zoom into the middle of this vast sea, and you'll find a tiny speck of land, the island of Moorea. It's one of more than 120 islands that belong to French Polynesia. Some of the islands near Moorea include Tahiti and Bora Bora, all of which are part of an archipelago within French Polynesia known as the Society Islands. Moorea is a volcanic island with steep mountains that reach nearly 4,000 feet, covered in dense green rainforest. Surrounding the island is a lagoon formed by a ring of coral reefs. Those reefs are what brings marine ecologist Dr. Adrienne Correa, my colleague at Rice University, all the way to this remote South Pacific island. I caught up with Adrienne during a field expedition to the Richard Gump Research Station, located at the water's edge near the mouth of Cook's Bay. Hey, Adrienne.
Hey, Scott. How's it going?
I'm so glad to get to talk with you while you're actually in Moorea. This is so cool. Yeah. So you're in Moorea right now and doing field work. And I'm wondering, I've never been to Moorea. I've seen pictures. It seems like it's a beautiful place. Can you kind of paint a picture for us? Like, what does it look like there? Like, where are you right now?
Right now, I am in the Richard Gump Research Station on the coast. So you can see, if I look out the window, you can see the water and some water tables, which is like a research area with flow through seawater that you can put tanks and experimental organisms. And I can see some boats that we use to go out in the lagoon or onto the fore reef to do field observations or in situ manipulations. You have these amazing mountain profiles to look at. And, it rains and there's rainbows and it's just a very beautiful spot on Earth. But inside here, it's like a regular office.
Inside the building, yeah. So you're at a field research station. So this is a place that, researchers or students go to study what kinds of things people study there? We'll talk about your work in a minute, but what are some of the general themes of the research there?
Well, I think people here at the research station are studying coral reef ecology and evolution, and also human uses and impacts on reefs, including some studies of how land-based uses like agriculture or growing livestock influence waterways that eventually make it out to the reefs. So,
corals are something that I think a lot of people think about as like something that's beautiful that we might like to go and try to see if we're, on a vacation, go snorkeling or scuba diving or something. But, they're also really important, right? I mean, why should people care about corals beyond just for their beauty?
Well, they are basically a quarter of the known diversity in the ocean lives on coral reefs. So that's an incredible amount.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Of the world's diversity. And some artists and photographers have attempted to kind of capture some of this diversity for people to just see, because a lot of it hides in cracks and crevices of the reef structure itself. And when you pull these organisms out, talk about infinite inspiration for movie characters. People also look at different things that these organisms can do to get ideas for machinery and technologies that we use today. So there are all sorts of wonderful, helpful things about these critters that we can use. But some of the biggest ways that reefs help us is by making this really massive amount of limestone framework or structure that can be uplifted and become land eventually. Many people physically live on top of old dead reef, and they also rely on that reef for food and or ecotourism. And then the reef framework itself is really important for breaking wave energy in those types of places. So, places like Miami, Florida, and other coastal cities with lots of development on the shoreline have major problems if they start to lose their reef because shoreline erosion increases, et cetera.
Yeah.
So really it's, people's livelihoods, where people live. And unfortunately, around the world, we're also starting to see climate refugees who literally, many people who live on islands at this point are having to leave the home that they've known because of sea level rise.
So we hear a lot in the news about corals being in danger. What's going on?
Well, this is one of those things where, corals get discussed as a canary in the coal mine. So unfortunately, we are seeing a huge amount of reef degradation over the last decades, and it is predicted to continue over the next decade. So we're losing lots of coral out there on reefs, and as we lose coral, we lose those reef structures and we lose those homes for those many other fish and turtles and all kinds of other organisms. And when I say we're losing a lot, that means like we've lost 50% of the Great Barrier Reef corals in the last 30 years. And over the next couple of decades, we are predicted to potentially have 70 to 90% of reefs around the world in their current state, which is already degraded from what they were previously, experience significant further degradation. And when you have reefs bleaching repeatedly, year after year or every couple of years, they're sick, and that costs them energetically. It's difficult, just like when we get really sick, when we have a very significant illness, there can be a long recovery time, and it can have subsequent impacts on, how we are able to do things. And so what happens for reefs is between increasing temperatures due to climate change, plus in many places, overfishing of fishes that remove things that compete with and overgrow corals. So if you remove things like parrotfish that would graze on algae that otherwise overgrow corals, you start to have algae taking over a reef. And that combined with also nutrient pollution, which often comes from poor land management practices. So if you have a lot of fertilizer running into a reef or a lot of erosion coming off the land and dumping sediments onto the reef, that can also kill corals. So over the last decades, we have really set up a situation where corals are dying from sort of multiple causes of stress.
And the bleaching that you were talking about, bleaching is when the symbiotic microorganisms that live inside the coral leave, right? And these are a kind of algae. You say the name because I can't pronounce it very well.
Symbiotic.
That's a good Scrabble word. Symbiotic. So those are the algae that live inside the tissue of the coral, right? And what do they do for the coral?
They generate food by photosynthesizing. So they use energy from the sun to make sugars. And one of the things that's really cool about these algae is that they make all this sugar and then they dump up to 95% of the sugar that they make out into the tissues of the coral that they're living inside of. And so that sugar ends up going to the coral and allowing the coral to have enough energy to build these massive reef frameworks that we see from space. So when we start getting into trouble with reef framework not being produced anymore and all those harms that it causes to human societies living near the ocean, a big part of that story is this partnership between the coral and that little algae breaking apart.
And that's what you're in Moorea now to study, right? To investigate one particular way that the algae can be associated with corals? So you've found that fish might be playing a role.
That's a big part of why we are interested in whether or not fish that eat corals can disperse those algae around a reef. Because as we are trying to think about how corals maybe can replenish their algae living in their tissues after they've been stressed, maybe one good source is these algae that fish have eaten by biting a coral. Amazingly, these algae, many of them can pass through the fish's digestive tract and then get number two'd around the reef. And so
the fish are pooping out these algae, basically.
They are pooping out these algae, yes.
Wow. And that can be helpful for the corals if they can pick up some of those beneficial algae.
Yeah, that's really what we are trying to test for these stony corals that make the big part of reefs right now. We've seen demonstrations that this can happen from other organisms. So like there are these anemone fish that bite anemones, and we have seen that anemones that don't have algae can acquire the algae from the feces from the poop of an anemone fish. And we've seen even with these stony reef building corals, for example, that larvae from a stony reef coral species can get those algae from a giant clam fecal pellet. So if you had not thought about giant clam fecal pellets yet today,
not yet today.
Giant clam poop pellets. So giant clams also host these Symbiodiniaceae algae, and they have that same kind of relationship that corals and those algae have. And giant clams release these poop pellets on the regular, and if you put some of those next to a coral larva that doesn't have any of its algae yet, it can get those algae. So it's right there. We can see many examples that make us really think that probably we may find that fish eating stony corals can then pass those algae to other stony corals. But we need to demonstrate that first.
I just love this. Who would have thought that fish poop could be so important?
Yeah. It's opened up this entire world where basically now all I do is think about fish poop and algae and it's been really fun because as we broaden out and look at more fish species and more corals and algae and water and sediments, sort of look at the whole ecosystem picture for which algae is where and how the fish might move it around, it's really changed the way we've thought about what some of the roles of these coral-eating fishes might be on a reef.
Yeah, I mean, you usually think of like parrotfish eating corals, and that's, a bad thing for the corals. They're getting munched on, but I guess they might be doing a service by helping to spread these beneficial algae. This is Wild World. I'm Scott Solomon, and I'm talking with my friend, coral biologist Dr. Adrienne Correa. Coming up, Adrienne explains why my vision of the beautiful life of a marine biologist working in the calm, clear waters of a sunny South Pacific island isn't necessarily that accurate. If you want to see our wild world for yourself, one of the best ways is with Lindblad Expeditions. Discovery is in the Lindblad DNA. They've been exploring the most amazing places on the planet for more than 50 years. They have the most advanced fleet of expedition ships in the world, and their trips create unprecedented opportunities for guests. Visit expeditions.com to see where in our wild world you'd like to explore next. You're listening to Wild World. I'm your host, Scott Solomon. I'm talking with my friend and colleague, marine biologist Dr. Adrienne Correa, during her field research expedition to the tropical island of Moorea in French Polynesia. So I know a little bit about what it's like to, put on snorkel gear and try to go underwater and, look at corals or collect data. But can you give people a little bit of a sense for what that takes? Because it's not something most people have experience with. Even if you've been scuba diving or snorkeling, doing all that while also trying to be a scientist and collect data is complicated. So can you kind of walk us through, like, if you're going out to collect data, in your scuba diving, like what is that like? What's the prep that goes into that? And what are all the things you have to kind of keep track of?
Well, I think one of the biggest things is trying to be both optimistic and realistic. And some of your ability to do that just comes from trying things out and experience. So essentially, because everything is harder to do underwater compared to on land, including communicating with your research buddies, your dive buddies, you want to talk about as much as possible before you actually get out doing your work. And so we almost like mime through our entire set of activities so that, to the point of like, okay, we're going to get in the water. And then what are we going to do? We're going to put on gloves. So we need gloves in a bag inside our dive kit.
And so this is happening like on the boat, like as you're like heading out there, or on land before you go out?
Even before, so that you're packing all of your stuff the night before. So we usually have, and a couple of the challenges that I think people often wouldn't recognize is that a lot of the things that we use to sample underwater float. And so like bags, paper, tubes, a lot of things, gloves, everything floats essentially. So
and that's a problem for you. Normally we think of that as being a good thing when you're on the water, but in your case, you don't want it to float because it's going to float away, right?
Yeah, the last thing you want to do is have plastic floating away from you in the ocean, and then you're contributing to marine pollution. So basically we like pre-label everything before we get in the water and usually tie it to bags or other things that we're carrying. So if you like organizing stuff and doing things in an organized way, this type of research is for you, because being meticulous and having things really mapped out and pre-organized helps. And so typically when you go into the water, when you see a picture of someone diving on a scuba diving magazine, or, someone who's just wearing their bathing suit and a scuba kit, that is not realistic of scientific diving. You have stuff clipped and strapped all over you essentially, and you're carrying around bags, and you're kind of covered in a camera and clipboards and bags and hammer and chisels or bone cutters, things like that.
Wow. That's a lot to keep track of.
Yeah. So the more you practice, the easier it gets. But the other thing, I guess, is conditions. So sometimes it's really gorgeous underwater. There's not a lot of current or surge. The weather is good. And, you can even get sunburned on your hands or parts sticking out from under your wetsuit at 30 feet. So sometimes conditions are gorgeous, but other times it's raining or there's a lot of surge pushing you around underwater. So sometimes one of the things I did as a postdoc was there were these fish exclusion cages that we put on the reef bottom temporarily to see what happens when you exclude fishes from eating algae that compete with corals. And a lot of stuff will start growing on those, we call them cages. And so you have to go out routinely and take a scrub brush and scrub the inside and the outside of the cage, or otherwise it gets covered in living organisms and then there's no water flow and it ruins your experiment. And there are times, for instance, when the surge or the weather conditions are difficult enough so that you're literally hanging on the cage and like your whole body is like blowing one way and then blowing the other way, and you're trying to scrub this thing. And so sometimes data collection is very physical and somewhat comical underwater. Sometimes you get kind of beaten up a little bit. Yeah. There's just a huge physicality to doing all of this.
Yeah. Yep.
I think when people imagine a scientist or maybe a marine biologist, I feel like the trope is like someone on a boat in beautiful weather with dolphins leaping around. But, a lot of times it's in the rain, or you're cold, or you're lifting heavy stuff, or you're getting bruised or banged up.
Yeah. Well, what about the good stuff? What's the best part of doing field work there? What parts of it are really fun? What keeps you coming back?
Oh, well, I mean, everything else. Basically it is really a gift to devote my working life to something that fascinates me. I mean, I am willing, because I am so fascinated about these questions and how things work, that fascination carries me through anything that's challenging and makes me want to do it. And it's beautiful on a reef, and you have the privilege of seeing amazing organisms and beautiful views. Another amazing thing is getting to interact with others. So I am lucky that I'm still trying to grow as a scientist and grow in my career and my work life, but I acutely remember being a student at all sorts of different stages and remember all the questions that you have about, will you make it through school and can you make it into a career in science? And so it's really fulfilling and exciting also to see and be able to support other people on that journey.
This is Wild World. I'm Scott Solomon. When we come back, I'll ask Adrienne about her career journey and learn about what other interesting things she studied before corals. The Rice University Traveling Owls program offers exciting intellectual itineraries to destinations around the globe. Traveling Owls trips serve as a catalyst for lifelong learning and strengthen bonds between Rice University alumni and friends. You don't have to be a Rice alum to participate in Traveling Owls programs. Visit alumni.rice.edu/travelingowls to see a list of upcoming trips. I'm Scott Solomon, and my guest today is my good friend Adrienne Correa, whose research on the microorganisms inside corals has taken her to the South Pacific island of Moorea. So, I've known you for a long time, but I don't think I ever heard about how you first got interested in science. Do you remember, how old were you when you first thought, I want to be a scientist? Or did you think that when you were young?
I think that my family always enjoyed going outdoors. And so I had some, in terms of particular snatches of things I remember going out with my mom and trying to find mushrooms with a mushroom guidebook and just being completely astonished at how goofy common names of mushrooms are and just realizing how much fungal diversity is out there and how tricky it can be to try to tell things apart. And I really like dichotomous keys. And then another thing is that I have an aunt and uncle who are botanists. And so I just always thought that seemed like a really neat thing to do, science. And then additionally, I have always just thought the ocean is fascinating. I think because when you can see what is in the water, they are very extraordinary and different seeming creatures. And also I love how when you look out at the ocean surface, you do not necessarily know what is right below you. Yep. And there have been a few times where I've plopped into the water and been like, whoa, I can't believe this was right down here under the boat.
Like what? What did you see?
So both of those are amazing. One of my very first scientific diving experiences was in the Florida Keys, and the weather wasn't great, and I didn't have a lot of diving skills or anything at that point, but I have a pretty super stomach. I don't tend to get seasick, and so I was the only person I was the only person remaining on the boat who was still ready to get in the water. So I went in to be somebody's dive buddy, and we plopped over the side, and there was this huge manta ray.
Oh,
like
wow.
A spaceship. I mean, it was enormous right below us. And I had my brain just was scrolling through options. When you are not expecting to come up on something that large, it's, at least for me, it takes my brain, it's like a scrolling through stuff. You see pictures on one of those casino machines that you pull. What are those called?
A slot machine?
Yeah, it's like the slot machine where your brain is just trying to call up, what is this? And then, after 5 seconds, you're like, okay, it's a ray.
Wow.
Whoa, this is so large.
You just couldn't process what it was because it was so big. Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. That's awesome. Okay, so you kind of had this interest in science, interest in the ocean. How did that happen to lead you into this career? Like, was it a straightforward path for you? Didn't you study ants at one point? I study ants. You almost became an ant biologist like I am.
Yeah, I think sometimes, as you're finding your path in science, there are so many cool questions out there. And I think that anybody who is pondering being a scientist, there are many possible paths and many disciplines that they could get excited about. And some of it is the twists and turns of the particular opportunities you get. And some of it is the occasional just like figuring out you're not very good at something. So for me, looking under a dissecting scope and dissecting out pitfall or trying to separate all of the insects in a pitfall trap, like I was really excited about those questions, but I had trouble doing that. And I know you must be like,
it's tedious. It's not always very much fun. Yeah.
So I love ants, and I think they are in Belize on our field course. You also have like totally opened up my eyes to further ant coolness.
But there are no ants in the ocean, sadly, as much as I've searched.
Not living ones, not for long. Yeah. But I guess for me it was just I was really excited about squid or cephalopods when I was in undergrad, and I also thought deep sea biology was really neat. Mm-hmm. The adaptations that organisms have to live in those extreme environments and hydrothermal vents and tube worms and yeti crabs and all those things. And then I just happened to, in terms of coral reefs, when I was doing my master's on ants, actually, the person who became my PhD advisor was also in the department. And so I learned I was like, oh, what's he doing? I like the ocean. And so that was the moment where I started learning about this partnership between corals and their algae. And I just found that to be extremely fascinating.
So what's been the most exciting thing that's happened so far this field season?
Oh, well, I think this field season for us in particular, we're here on the first trip associated with new funding. And so we're kind of out on a limb or out on a coral branch, if you will, trying a whole bunch of new things. And so I think the most exciting thing overall is just the amount of learning and reality checks that have been coming at rapid speed. So just, I guess, trying to keep up with that. And one thing that we did do on the side was go on a snorkeling trip on our one afternoon off. We were able to snorkel with some humpback whales. So that was something I had never done before.
Oh, yeah. What was that like?
Amazing. It was really cool. It was out in open ocean, a humpback mom and her baby. And 3 times we had the opportunity to see them. And the baby was pretty playful. And it was pretty incredible. Yeah.
That is incredible. Oh my gosh, what an experience.
Yeah.
Now you texted me some photos at one point of something that was exciting that happened while you guys were there.
Which ones? Sorry, you have to tell me what they looked like.
I believe it was coral spawning.
Oh, yes, that was very exciting. So coral spawning is is when corals en masse reproduce. And so there are there are various different ways that corals can do it. The coral species that were spawning here at this time release a bundle, these little pink balls that are egg and sperm bundles, and they float up to the surface of the water, and then the bundles start breaking apart, and the eggs and sperm separate, and then they all start fertilizing each other. So this was my first time getting to participate in anything related to spawning. And it was really interesting to see how researchers work with that process and the approaches that they have worked out to try to maximize fertilization success and survival. Because you're basically trying to help corals go through these different life stages and eventually get to something that's a larvae that looks like a sesame seed. And then eventually there are other phases, but eventually those larvae will start settling out on the bottom and make a single polyp, which looks like a hand, that eventually splits and grows and divides and turns into what we would normally recognize as a coral colony. So it was very interesting to learn about that process and start trying to hook into that research-wise. And I also learned a lot about how much, despite the fact that we know a fair amount about when certain coral species spawn and how they typically are, you can predict when they will spawn a number of days after the full moon in particular months for these corals that we're working with. But even though we know that predicted number of days, there's still a fair amount of variation for when different coral colonies actually spawn and how much they spawn, et cetera. So it's like night after night after night of being ready to go. And then maybe something happens, maybe it doesn't. It's a lot of, it definitely extends the workday.
Yeah, it sounds exciting though. I mean, what a natural, like an amazing natural phenomenon to get to witness, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's really neat. It's very tiny, in some corals release planula, which is sort of a bigger life stage than egg and sperm bundles. My eyesight, if you want to test your eyesight, come and do some spawning with broadcast spawners.
They're just that tiny, yeah. You're listening to Wild World. I'm your host, Scott Solomon. In our final segment, we'll find out about some simple things that we can all do, no matter where we live, that can help save corals in Moorea and around the world. I love to travel and experience new places, and I've had the great pleasure of joining several Rice Traveling Owls trips operated by Lindblad Expeditions. Each of these trips, from the Galapagos Islands to the Belize Barrier Reef, Baja California, and the upper Amazon River, has been absolutely incredible. Lindblad Expeditions make nature and wildlife accessible to anyone. Visit alumni.rice.edu/travelingowls or expeditions.com to learn more and to see where in our wild world you'd like to explore next. This is Wild World. I'm Scott Solomon, and I'm talking with my friend, coral biologist Dr. Adrienne Correa, about her work on the essential relationships between microorganisms that live symbiotically with corals in Moorea, which are being disrupted by human activity. So what can people who are listening do to help corals? Like, what can people do regardless of where they live if they want to help corals?
First, just recognizing that climate change is an issue for corals, and that we need, like, the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC committee, et cetera, that, we're missing the window on limiting temperature increase to 1.5 degrees C. We really need to be united in taking significant action, basically every possible action at this point, to try to turn things around from a climate change perspective. I think that is the absolute biggest thing that we can do to help reefs and other ecosystems. And so placing pressure, helping politicians understand that is what we all want is critical, and supporting markets that are identifying and making alternative energy sources and products more mainstream and readily available would be useful. And then I think just in general, for someone in the United States, for example, just thinking about our daily life and consumption, whether it's trying to ride a bike or walk when you can, to just one of the things I think about a lot is, do I need all of this stuff? Can I find something with less packaging? And we've seen this in Belize, even in a, UNESCO World Heritage Reef site far from shore, trash is getting significant amounts of trash get washed up on the beach. Like this, we use an insane amount of materials in our daily lives. And we have I think because of the fast pace of city life, for example, there's a lot of disposable living, and we just throw out a lot of stuff, and it does end up out on reefs and in the environment.
I guess that's especially true for people who are living near corals.
I mean, people living near corals can drive forward initiatives that are very specific, related to, trying to make sure that waste disposal, placing pressure or developing campaigns to try to take care of local sources of pollution or stress, but I think that many of the things that individuals can do to try to help reefs, it doesn't matter if you live right next to a reef or if you live far away, so any runoff from land goes into waterways and then makes it to the ocean. So things that we do in the middle of a country, like using excessive amounts of fertilizer or pesticide, are going to make it out to the reef. And then additionally, I think we need to vote, and we need to let policymakers and managers know that we care about these issues and that they are a priority for us. So I think the biggest thing that you can do is vote.
Lastly, I just want to ask, why go all the way to Moorea for your work? We have coral reefs closer to us in the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico, where I know you work as well. But what is it that keeps you going back to Moorea, which is so far away in the middle of the Pacific Ocean?
Well, that's a great question. First, I want to acknowledge the people of French Polynesia, and that this is their reef and their land, and that they allow us to come and conduct this research here. And I think about that particularly, when I biopsy a coral colony or take a fish off the reef, because I'm using their resources. So I want to acknowledge that. One of the amazing things about getting to work here is that it's a relatively higher coral cover reef compared to some places that are readily accessible in the Caribbean. And so it's a more coral dominated habitat compared to some parts of the Florida Keys, for example. And then another thing is that it's a shallow water reef where we can work. So Gulf of Mexico is a really cool system, but it's further offshore and starts much deeper. So there are different limitations for what you can do on a reef like that. But another amazing part of getting to work here specifically is that the Gump Station is the site of the Moorea Coral Reef Long-Term Ecological Research Site, which is, the abbreviation is MCR-LTER, which is supported by the National Science Foundation, or NSF, for a whole community of researchers to come and study this reef, to study, sort of what processes are contributing to either resilience or changes in the reef ecosystem. And so by coming and working here, there's a whole network of researchers and expertise that we can plug into. There are a lot of long-term data sets on coral cover, fish abundance, fish species, algae, all sorts of things that we can use to contextualize the data that we might collect in any given study. And so that's extremely helpful sometimes and really valuable.
So how does studying corals in one particular place like Moorea, in a lot of detail like you guys are doing, help us to understand what's happening with corals worldwide?
Well, the coral species that are found in Moorea are coral species, the main ones that we are working on, and these main groups of fish that we're working on to try to, understand if coral-eating fishes may be able to help, like kind of provide a probiotic to stressed out corals. The groups of fish and the groups of corals that we're doing these experiments with are found all throughout the Pacific. And we're also doing some of this work in the Caribbean as well. So we are picking one place to really understand the system and do our initial tests, but this is something that can be broadly applicable to reefs around the world. And one of the areas where there's a difficult mismatch at this point is the threats to reefs are very near term and happening. This reef degradation is happening very quickly. And so, the timescales on which we would want to develop interventions to support reefs or try to restore reefs are right now. We really need to be doing things right now. But many areas of research where we're trying to understand, can we develop a reef probiotic that's either delivered by coral-eating fish or some other way? Those types of things, we can work quickly to try to find a solution, but then it doesn't stop there. You also have to find a way, once you've got a potential solution, to scale up to something that could be delivered over hundreds of kilometers of reef or through massive outplanting and restoration. So it's very, and then we also would need to, at the same time, stop the human-driven sources of reef decline or, lessen those significantly, or otherwise we can spend a lot of time and energy trying to provide these therapies to corals, but then we're just going to make them sick right away after, and reef decline will likely continue.
Yeah. So clearly corals are facing an uncertain future. So how do you stay optimistic?
Well, I think one thing I do is recognize that I don't understand everything about how all of these processes play out. Ecosystems and the earth are complex. A lot of times I am troubled by that uncertainty because I worry that it's more likely that something we haven't anticipated will cause things to degrade more quickly rather than to be an escape hatch or a way that things can survive. But I try to remember that I might not understand or be able to conceptualize how things will play out at really large scales. And then I think there are bright spots in terms of genetic material and places on Earth. And I hope that human society can change. I think this is a difficult time to look for coordinated human society response in terms of taking action on the timelines that we need to in order to limit the amount of damage that we're going to have from something like climate change. So that's hard. To be completely honest, I think some of it is trying to remember to look at optimism points and not just pessimism points or concern points. But I think also part of it is coping, where I just can't think about it all the time. There's something called ecological grief, where you feel sadness or loss of environmental ecosystems or diversity. I definitely struggle with that. And I think sometimes I just try to focus on a particular aspect of the bigger global problem, or what type of solution I am best positioned to try to work towards. And I try to stay thinking about that because that's something at a scope that I can manage. Often actually it's teaching something like coral reef ecosystems, or I'm about to start teaching global change biology, where I zoom out, or going to a conference and hearing a lot of different talks about a lot of different things. Those are moments when you look at everything together, when it can really hit you how many challenges we face today.
Yeah.
So
I
don't know if that helps, but if we quit, then things definitely are not going to go well. So I am committed to continuing to try.
All right. Last question. Are the rainforests coral reefs of the land or coral reefs are the rainforests of the sea?
I think we both know that rainforests are the coral reefs of the land. That's obvious.
All right. Well, thanks so much for talking with me and telling us about your work in Moorea, and good luck with the rest of your field season.
Thanks for having me.
That's it for this episode. To learn more about Dr. Adrienne Correa's research on corals and their microbes, check out the Correa Lab website at owlnet.rice.edu/tilde, that's the little squiggly line, AC53, or you can follow them on social media. For more information about the Gump Research Station in Moorea, visit moorea.berkeley.edu. This episode of Wild World was produced by 3Wire Creative with support from Lindblad Expeditions and the Rice Alumni Traveling Owls. Visit alumni.rice.edu/traveling owls or expeditions.com to get more information about their trips to the South Pacific and other destinations, and to book your cabin for the experience of a lifetime. Thanks for listening. I'm your host, Scott Solomon. Join me next time as we explore another part of our wild world. Next time on Wild World, we're digging deep to uncover a world that seems both alien and yet familiar. We'll meet millions of tiny farmers practicing a form of agriculture that's existed for more than 50 million years. And it's all happening right beneath our feet.